The Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire. The Early Christian Church, 4th to 6th centuries A.D. In context. Focus, early Christian views of same-sex relations. Before, 5th or 6th century B.C., the biblical book of Genesis takes its final form. Circa 57 C.E., Jesus Apostle Paul condemns male and female homoeroticism in his letter to the Romans. 79 A.D., a volcanic eruption destroys Pompeii in southern Italy. Erotic art, later found in the ruins, attests to same-sex practices in the Roman Empire. After 11th century, the Church develops the concept of sodomy to describe all non-reproductive sexual acts. 13th century, secular authorities in Europe begin to criminalize sodomy. Early Christian writers used several passages from the Bible to condemn homoerotic behavior. Key among these was the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis, a disaster believed by some to have been a punishment for same-sex relations among the city's inhabitants. This interpretation has contributed to homophobic readings of the narrative, but the biblical text itself is imprecise about the nature of the deeds that led to Sodom and Gomorrah's downfall. Sins of Sodom. Book of Genesis chapter 19 tells how two angels arrived in Sodom to investigate the city's sins. The patriarch offered to accommodate them in his home within the city, but before Lot's household went to bed, Sodom's inhabitants surrounded the house and called on Lot to deliver his guests that we may know them. The book of Genesis chapter 19 verse 5. Prioritizing the well-being of his guests, Lot offered his 2 daughters in their place. Threatened with violence, Lot and his family were escorted out of the city by the angels. Subsequently, Sodom and the nearby city of Gomorrah, which was also deemed sinful, were annihilated when God rained down brimstone and fire, a biblical expression that symbolizes divine anger as a punishment for the wrongdoing of its citizens. The meaning of the Sodomite mob's desire to know Lot's guests has attracted much speculation. While the Hebrew word translated as know can have sexual connotations in the scriptures, many modern commentators, in a return to early Jewish readings of the Sodom story, agree that the city's wickedness did not concern homoerotism, but rather the sins of inhospitality and rape. Supporting evidence. The modern interpretation of the Genesis passage is bolstered by comparisons with a biblical narrative describing the rape of a Levite's concubine. The book of Judges, chapter 19, tells how a member of the Hebrew tribe of Levi, his concubine, and his servant sought lodging in Gibeah, and an old man in the city offered to host the party, but Gibeah's inhabitants knocked on the old man's door and asked him to bring the Levite so they could abuse him. The old man refused the request, offering up his own daughter and the Levite's concubine as alternatives, and begged them not to commit this unnatural crime on his guest. The concubine was handed over to the men who abused her all night and left her dead on the old man's doorstep. Reading the Genesis and Judges stories together, two similarities stand out. First, both can be read as impairing a lesson about hospitality. The tales narrate breaches of the obligation of the host to traveler. Second, each story revolves around sexual violence or its threatened use as a means of exerting power over strangers. After all, if the Sodomites had accepted Lot's offer to deliver his daughters instead of the angels, the girls would have been raped. And in Judges, one of the rapes offered to the mob ends up being raped and killed. In both cases, the city's inhabitants were guilty not of homoeroticism, but of inhospitality, a sin manifested respectively in acts of attempted or actual rape. Consequently, the primary message Judaism took from the book of Genesis chapter 19 was that as concerned that outsiders should be treated fairly and without hostility. Retribution and apocalypse. Elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures, Sodom's destruction was sometimes cited as an example of sudden divine retribution. However, these references did not concern same-sex copulation or desire specifically. The prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel compared the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah with the sins of Judah or Jerusalem, but they made no explicit reference to sexual activity in this context. Christian scriptures contain just one direct reference to sexual immorality, as the case of Sodom and Gomorrah's downfall, and a short epistle attributed to the Apostle Jude. The book of Revelations, which concludes the canonical Christian Bible and was written by the Apostle John the Divine in the 1st century A.D., also makes passing reference to Sodom. Here the city's fiery fate is interrupted as prefiguring both the burning of Babylon as part of the global apocalypse at the end of time and the fiery torments of the damned in hell following God's final judgment. But neither of these references explicitly represents homoerotism as the target of divine anger. Other prohibitions. Separate from the Sodom story, the Hebrew book of Leviticus includes two passages that appear to prohibit same-sex acts. One passage condemns men who lie with mankind as with womankind as an abomination, the book of Leviticus chapter 18 verse 22, while the other announces the men guilty of this crime be put to death, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 13. Although there seems to have been no direct connection between the Levitical laws and the sins of Sodom, these Judaic prohibitions sometimes inspired legislation that made sodomy a capital offense in medieval Christian states. Christ's apostle Paul referred in his biblical writings to those who abandon natural use by engaging in homoerotic acts. Paul's letter to the Romans has enjoyed particular prominence among Christian theologians as a pretext for condemning same-sex erotic behavior. It also contributed to a heightened awareness among early Christians of female as well as male homoeroticism. Homoeroticism. During the first millennium of Christianity, many writers tried to make sense of biblical references to homoerotism and the Sodom story. But there was initially no consensus among Christians about the nature of the sins of Sodom, which were variously identified as inhospitality, pride, gluttony, self-indulgence, and carnality. However, a homophobic interpretation eventually came to predominate when Sodom epitomized the affront of God of unbridled homoerotic lust. This reading first emerged in the 4th and 5th centuries AD in the writings of the Church Fathers, such as John Chrysostom and Augustine of Hippo, who established the doctrinal foundations of Christianity. In the 6th century, another Church Father, Gregory the Great, who eventually became Pope, described the biblical Sodomites as being possessed by depraved thoughts and perverse pleasures. Gregory's language has been taken to refer to same-sex desires specifically, and his remarks proved to be influential. Gregory enlisted the Sodom narrative within his broader teachings on Havaria, a Latin term which roughly corresponds to the English word lust. Defined by early Christians as a sin of intense disorderly desire that fatally distracts humanity from the love of God, luxuria was identified by Gregory as one of the 7 deadly sins that every Christian should spurn. Bonds of love. To flee from burning Sodom is to refuse the illicit fires of the flesh. Gregory the Great. Early Christian readings of the Bible were interpreted that Sodom's doom as being triggered by expressions of same-sex desire and lust were not inevitable. Alongside the laws and narratives inspired by these interpretations, Hebrew scriptures also include celebrations of love, intimacy, and passionate friendship between same-sex couples. The most significant of there was the account in the book of Samuel of the close relationship between Jonathan and David. Jonathan was the son of Saul, king of Israel, while David was his potential rival for the throne. The biblical text describes how, after fighting together against the Philistines, the pair formed a covenant of love, Jonathan even going so far as to give his clothes and armor to David because he loved him as his own soul. First book of Samuel, chapter 18, verse 1. When Jonathan was later slain in battle, David lamented to the loss of his brother, whose love was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. The second book of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 26. While early Christians generally interpreted such statements in Platonic terms and as expressions of passionate but not necessarily erotic same-sex attachment, readers of the Bible from the 16th century on have sought to highlight the homoerotic dimensions to these relationships. At his 1895 trial for gross indecency, Anglo-Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde cited Jonathan and David as a positive example of the love that dare not speak and name, a pure noble form of affection between two men. As such, despite biblical passages playing a key role in early Christian condemnations of homoeroticism, they have also provided value in the search for queer forefathers in later centuries. The soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. The first book of Samuel, chapter 18, verse 1. Ruth and Naomi. The biblical book of Ruth describes how Naomi, who was living with her husband in the land of Moab, decides to return home following the death of her husband and sons. She sends her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, who have outlived their husbands, Naomi's sons, to their mothers to find new husbands. While Orpah returns home, Ruth remains behind, pledging never to leave Naomi. For where you go, I will go. The book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth's place in Naomi was sometimes celebrated by early Christians as an archetype of virtuous love and female fellowship. Although the biblical text does not explicitly indicate a romantic interest between the pair, artistic depictions of the episode in later centuries sometimes show Ruth tenderly touching or embracing her mother-in-law. Since the story describes a loving relationship and a lifelong commitment between women, Ruth's words featured in some female marriage ceremonies.